The architecture of invisible strength. There's a moment that happens in silence. A moment when someone realizes they've been carrying a weight so long, they forgot what their posture looked like before it bent. It doesn't announce itself. There's no ceremony, just a breath that feels different, heavier. Like the air itself has learned the password to rooms inside you that you keep locked. You might be standing at a window, washing dishes, driving home on a familiar road. The location is irrelevant. What matters is the recognition, that quiet, devastating clarity when you understand that somewhere along the way, you became fluent in a language most people will never have to learn. The language of endurance, not the kind that gets medals or applause, the kind that happens in the margins of ordinary days, the kind that teaches your nervous system to translate danger in whispers, to read threat in the grammar of silence, to conjugate fear in the future tense before the present moment even arrives. The archaeology of adaptation. Here's what nobody tells you about surviving difficult things. Your brain doesn't just remember them, it archives them. It creates an entire infrastructure around them, like a city building walls after an invasion. Except these walls are invisible. They're made of prediction algorithms and threat assessments and contingency plans that run constantly in the background of your consciousness. Neuroscience has a term for this: allostatic load. It's the cumulative burden of chronic stress and life events on your body and brain. But that clinical phrase doesn't capture what it actually feels like to live inside a nervous system that has been remodeled by necessity. It feels like this: you become a cartographer of other people's moods. You can map the topology of a conversation within seconds, sensing the valleys of discomfort, the peaks of tension, the fault lines where conflict might erupt. This isn't a superpower you asked for. It's a survival skill that embedded itself into your neural pathways the way water carves canyons into stone. Slowly, inevitably, through repetition you never chose. You develop what psychologists call hypervigilance, but that word makes it sound like a choice, like something you could simply turn off. The truth is stranger and more profound. Your brain has reorganized its priority systems. It has recalibrated what counts as important information. While others are scanning for opportunities, you're scanning for inconsistencies. While others are present, you're already 3 moves ahead in the chess game of potential outcomes. This is not paranoia. This is pattern recognition raised to the level of instinct. The paradox of invisible competence. And here's where it gets complicated, where the psychology becomes layered. In ways that even you don't fully recognize to the outside world, you appear unusually capable. Mature beyond your years, composed, grounded. People use words like wise and thoughtful, and together they come to you with their problems because something about your presence suggests you can hold weight without collapsing. They're not wrong, but they're not completely right either. What they're sensing is not strength. It's structural reinforcement. It's the psychological equivalent of a building that's been earthquake-proofed, not because it's naturally stronger, but because it's been forced to adapt to conditions that would level structures that never faced such tests. You didn't develop emotional intelligence as a natural gift. You developed it as a decoding mechanism. When the emotional environment around you was unpredictable, your brain did what all brains do when faced with chaos. It looked for patterns. It built prediction models. It created frameworks for understanding what couldn't be controlled. Some children learn to read books early. You learn to read rooms, to read faces, to read the space between what someone says and what they mean. This literacy came at a cost that nobody calculates, because the tuition was paid in moments of your childhood that should have been spent on different lessons entirely. The currency of emotional labor, that an economic principle called opportunity, costs the value of what you give up when you choose one thing over another. For people who've endured prolonged emotional complexity, the opportunity cost of survival is innocence, not innocence in some romanticized sense, but innocence as the ability to exist without constant interpretation, the ability to trust without verification, the ability to be present without simultaneously existing 3 minutes in the future, preparing for outcomes that may never arrive. You learn to become the emotional stabilizer in systems that were inherently unstable. You learned that your regulation could compensate for someone else's dysregulation. You learned that if you could just be calm enough, patient enough, understanding enough, you could prevent the earthquake. Except earthquakes aren't caused by insufficient calmness. They're geological events. And yet your nervous system internalized a different story, that your emotional management could control outcomes that were never yours to control. This creates an exhausting internal economy. You spend your emotional resources preemptively. You invest in preventing problems that may not emerge. You hedge against risks that exist primarily in the probability matrix your brain has constructed from past data, and the result: you become rich in capacity and poor in rest. The neuroscience of selective vulnerability. Here's something the self-help narratives get wrong. They tell you to be vulnerable as if vulnerability is a binary switch. But for someone whose vulnerability was once exploited, weaponized, or ignored, vulnerability isn't simple. It's strategic. Research in attachment theory reveals something crucial. People with histories of complex emotional experiences don't lack the capacity for intimacy. They possess selective intimacy systems, sophisticated mechanisms that determine who gets access to which parts of their inner world. You don't open up slowly because you're afraid. You open up slowly because you're intelligent. Your brain has data. It has evidence that not all people can hold what you share with the care it deserves. So you test. You observe. You reveal yourself in installments, monitoring the response to each disclosure like a scientist monitoring variables in an experiment. This isn't walls. This is intentional architecture. You're not closing people out. You're determining who has demonstrated the structural integrity to be let in. The confusion comes because this looks like guardedness to people who've never needed such systems. But guardedness suggests fear. What you're practicing is discernment, a far more sophisticated response to complexity. The transformation hidden in repetition. But here's the part that even you might not see yet. Everything you've survived hasn't just left marks, it's left materials. Raw materials for building something unprecedented. Think about metallurgy. The strongest steel isn't steel that's been protected from heat. It's steel that's been subjected to intense heat and then rapidly cooled, a process called quenching. The molecular structure literally changes. It becomes something it could never have been without that precise sequence of stress and recovery. Your psychology has undergone something similar. Not breaking, not damage. Transformation at the molecular level of consciousness. You've developed emotional range that spans from profound empathy to necessary detachment, the ability to feel deeply without being destroyed by depth. Cognitive flexibility that allows you to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that people can be both hurtful and hurting, that you can be both strong and struggling, that healing is both happening and incomplete. Anticipatory awareness that reads social dynamics with the precision of someone who learned that survival sometimes depended on such readings. Meaning-making capacity that transforms experiences into insights, pain into perspective, confusion into clarity. These aren't compensations for damage. These are evolutionary adaptations. Your consciousness evolved new capabilities because the old ones were insufficient for the complexity you encountered. The burden of involuntary wisdom, yet wisdom that arrives too early, carries its own weight. It creates a strange temporal displacement. You're living at the intersection of multiple ages. Part of you is as old as your experiences. Part of you is exactly as young as your years. Part of you is frozen at the age when certain lessons were first learned. This creates what psychologists call cognitive dissonance, but in your case, it's more like existential dissonance. You understand things you wish you didn't. You see patterns you'd prefer to ignore. You carry knowledge that makes ignorance impossible. And sometimes, often, you find yourself longing not for innocence exactly, but for the permission to not know. The permission to be confused without immediately analyzing your confusion. The permission to feel without immediately understanding your feelings. The permission to simply exist without simultaneously observing yourself existing. Because that's another adaptation you developed, the internal observer. That part of you that watches you even as you're living. That narrates your experience even as you're having it. That analyzes your emotions even as you're feeling them. It's exhausting to be both the person living life and the person studying that person living life, but you couldn't turn it off, even if you wanted to. Because that observer was once your protector, the part of you that stayed alert when alertness mattered. The revolution of gentleness. But here's the revolution that's available to you now. The truth that changes everything. You can choose gentleness without weakness. You can choose softness without vulnerability. You can choose ease without carelessness. This is the part they don't tell you. That all those systems you built, all that vigilance, all that pattern recognition, all that emotional infrastructure, they're not permanent sentences. They're adaptive responses that can adapt again when the conditions change. Your nervous system learned threat. It can learn safety, not by forgetting the lessons of danger, but by integrating new data, by experiencing repeated instances of security, by building evidence that the world you're in now is not the world that taught you those first defenses. This doesn't happen quickly. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to rewire itself, requires repetition. It requires patient, consistent exposure to new patterns. It requires you to practice trust even when trust feels dangerous, to practice rest even when rest feels irresponsible, to practice receiving even when receiving feels uncomfortable. The alchemy of integration, what you're moving toward, isn't healing that erases your past. It's integration that honors it. It's the ability to carry your history without being controlled by it, to acknowledge your adaptations without being limited by them.
That's too fun.
To appreciate your emotional
but
intelligence
honestly,
without being
the
exhausted
atmosphere
by
here
its
tonight
constant
is
operation.
just
This is
incredible,
post-traumatic
isn't it?
growth, not as some inspirational concept, but as a documented psychological phenomenon where people don't just return to baseline after difficulty, but develop capacities that transcend their previous functioning. You're not broken and being fixed. You're complex and becoming integrated. You're learning to be the person who can hold both strength and softness, who can be both protective and open, who can be both wise about danger and curious about possibility, who can honor the systems that kept you safe while building new systems designed not for survival, but for flourishing. The invitation, so if you recognize yourself in these words, if you've lived it. Psychology from the inside. Here's what I want you to know. Your depth is not a wound. It's a dimension. Your sensitivity is not a weakness. It's a capacity. Your caution is not fear. It's wisdom. Your emotional complexity is not a problem to solve. It's a language to master. And the person you're becoming, the one who's learning to live from wholeness instead of fragments, from choice instead of reflex, from intention instead of protection, that person is not abandoning who you were. That person is honoring who you were by giving them what they never had, the safety to finally rest, the permission to be uncertain, the freedom to need without shame, the grace to be imperfect without catastrophe. You spent years becoming strong enough to survive. Now you get to become brave enough to soften, wise enough to trust, integrated enough to choose. Not because the world has earned it, but because you have earned the right to live in a way that honors not just what you survived, but who you want to become. The architecture of your strength was built without your permission. But the architecture of your future, that's yours to design. With all the wisdom you've gathered, with all the compassion you've developed, with all the depth you've earned. You didn't just go through too much. You alchemized it into something rare. A consciousness capable of profound understanding, intentional living, and revolutionary gentleness. That's not recovery. That's evolution. And it's only just beginning.